jusqu'à l'infini. Ce soir, je te suis jusqu'à l'infini, jusqu'à l'infini. Ce soir, ce soir, je te suis.
Welcome to Greats in Thought Seminar 6, a mid-season review of Michel Foucault's Psychiatric Power, lectures 1 through 6, with some more reflections and guidance upon how to read Foucault, both generally and in the context of the present moments of this work, in the context of his oeuvre. For the next 2 weeks, we will take a break from Foucault, considering the mind-bending work of Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger, that considers similar issues at a similar moment, but from a more grounded anthropological perspective. Greats in Thought. Read, riff, rapscalionate in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Secondaries down there in the plaza. Blue 3, Blue 4, hold out over position X-ray. Duke 6, we've got wounded down there.
Where's that Custer? I want my wounded out of there in the hospital in 15 minutes. I want my men out.
Fucking savages.
Come here in these streets. This goddamn eat up with enemy down here. I'm taking fire. I'm taking hits all over our street. 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock my position. Drawing fire. I'm drawing heavy fire. Yeah. Mayday, mayday. I'm going in. The tail rotor's out. I got control.
What do you think?
Wow, it's really exciting, man.
No, the waves! The waves!
Oh, right.
Look at that, breaks both ways. Watch.
This LZ's still pretty hot, sir. Maybe I ought to search somewhere else.
What do you know about surfing, Major? You're goddamn new church. Come here. Change.
You mean right now, sir?
I want to see how radical that stuff is. Don't change.
Still pretty hairy out there, sir.
You want to surf, soldier?
Yes, sir.
That's good, son, because you either surf or fight. That's clear. Now get going. I'll cover for him. That's for the board for lads.
Good shit till the boat gets here.
Lads, I'll bet you can't when you get out there. See how they break both ways? One guy can break right, one left simultaneous. What do you think of that?
Bill, I think we gotta wait for the tide to come up.
Hey, Lance, come here. Look, look. The tide doesn't come in for 6 hours. You want to wait here for 6 hours?
God damn it! Don't you think it's a little risky for R&R?
If I say it's safe to surf this beach, Captain, it's safe to surf this beach. I mean, I'm not afraid to surf this place. I'm trying to surf this fucking place. Where are you, soldier? Up on this Big Duke 6. God damn it! I'm on the tree line bomb!
Big Duke 6, Roger, 013, stand by.
Moment to the Stone Age, son!
Need some napalm down in the tree line. Can you get twisted around time to put it down there? Right, 1-3, you were big to fuck with. What's target? I'm gonna press some mortar fire off the tree line down there. Roger, here we go. Good, give it all you got and bring in all your ships. Wing abreast.
Get it out of here! And tell my guys I can go forward!
Big Duke 6, this is 013. The jet's being by now. There, you got about 30 seconds to on the station. Get your people back and get down. It's gonna be a big one.
Smell that? You smell that? Napalm, son! Nothing else in the world smells like that. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know, one time we had a hail bomb for 12 hours. When it was all over, I woke up. We didn't find one of them, not one stinking dink body. Smell! You know that gasoline smell? A whole hill. Smelled like victory.
Greats in thought.
Hello. All right. So a bit of a change there. That Patrick wasn't expecting, but for anyone who is watching, though I doubt anyone would choose to sit and listen to us two when it's such a beautiful evening. My room is south facing, so I am sweating it up right in here behind closed blinds.
I can almost see the dewdrops there.
You're a bit quiet, Patrick.
Am I really? Can you hear me now?
I can.
Now? Yeah.
I mean, no, you need to turn your gain up.
Now?
Too loud.
Too loud.
Yeah, it's clipping.
Oh, what about this?
Yeah, that works.
All right, cool.
Okay, so Patrick didn't know that I was going to start with that little introduction, which was a kind of edit that I made of one of the key moments of one of undoubtedly the greatest Hollywood masterpieces. So why Apocalypse Now? Why now? What's it got to do with Foucault? Specifically, the issues that are beginning to emerge in his work, in the present moment of his work, and that he will be entangled with for the next 7 years in terms of his lectures, and the next decade in terms of his publications. So what I would like to do is I'd like to reimagine this scene not simply as a work of cinema, but as a profound work of philosophy. And I want to do that through a close reading of 3 moments. There are many more, and there's much more to be said. I'll indicate a few things before I move on to Hat-Trick, but I'll limit myself to these 3. So the first kind of moment that I think is really is a philosophical moment is the moment when the kid is the helicopter's landed. I'm not going, and he has to be kind of dragged out, Now, in philosophy, as in life, you're always arriving into a war zone. Heidegger, who was a major influence on Foucault, in fact, without whom Foucault's work is unimaginable. Patrick's noted before the kind of phenomenological character of his work, which, you know, almost certainly bears a very strong resemblance, or draws very strongly upon Heidegger's architectonics of what he calls Dasein. Now, Heidegger calls this already arriving not necessarily into a war zone, but into a certain state of affairs, thrownness. It's the undeniable fact that you are thrown into a world, a context, a scenario, whether you like it or not. Sometimes, like the young man in the helicopter, you can try and refuse the truth of your thrownness, your context, your scenario, the particular moment of history that you are thrown into. I mean, remember, after all, that most of the soldiers in Vietnam were sent there against their will. They were drafted. But even, you know, if you imagined, if these were your wildest dreams, if you were as rich as King Midas, if you were the sovereign, the ruler of the entire world, you are in the end still subject to forces that far exceed you in every imaginable fashion. So in a way, the soldier who pulls the young man into battle is committing a paradigmatic philosophical act. You can refuse all you like, but it is what it is, and sometimes you have to be dragged, kicking and screaming. The second moment is where the aptly named Major Kilgore says, "You either surf or you fight!" Because sure, you can catch a wave, live the vibes life, enjoy the sun, the beach, the girls, the parties, live for the ride, man, delicious. But in the end, you are merely living the life of a grazing cow. Or you can get involved and join the fight, whichever fight really. I mean, there's enough going around. But you have to make that choice. Even when it is fight or die, you still have a choice. As Albert Camus put it, the first question of philosophy is whether or not to commit suicide. So again, in this brilliant character, I have to say he's my favourite character in the history of cinema, maybe, but certainly in war films. We have in this major character, Major Kilgore, a moment of profound philosophical import. You either surf or you fight. The third moment, and this takes us away from the compressed edit of the scene that I made somewhat, and to the broader arc, narrative or story, of which this scene, widely regarded as one of the greatest moments in cinematic history, is a small part of just 20 minutes or so of a 3-hour epic. Now, the broader story is, of course, that of the commander gone rogue, who's living in the rainforest beyond all pale, and the young captain is sent to terminate his command by any means necessary. Now, amidst the noise, the violence, the ride of the Valkyries, blood, pain and suffering, something absolutely crucial goes unnoticed. And that's why. Why all this violence? Why all the killing? Why all the suffering and pain? Because it's not, in fact, at all to carry the young captain up the river in service of his mission, but because one of his troop is a famous surfer. This infamous scene, barely anyone seems to notice, is almost incidental per the grander story. It is an accident, a happenstance. Central Intelligence have forgotten all about the young captain and his mission, as Nha Trang have not forwarded his orders to Major Kilgore. And it is only for the chance to see the famous surfer, Lance Armstrong, do his thing that all of this madness happens. And we will see later in Foucault's work, and more as we work through his lectures, that so many of the best moments that he stumbled on by accident were in the process of doing something else. Great works, great thinkers, great thought. It doesn't emerge, as Bataille might put it, from the subordination of each and every activity to some purpose or telos, the utilitarian adjudication of which tells us whether or not it is worthwhile. Philosophy and thought at its best is luxurious and exuberant form of wasteful expenditure, and from which, as if by accident, greatness emerges. Now, just the other few kind of things to pick up on is one, the philosophical journey is one of turbulence, it's one of violence of the self, of the soul, of one's sense of the world. You get hurt. People get hurt. And it's difficult. The other kind of historical note that I'd like to make is that whilst Foucault is talking about this confrontation between truth and power, of which I want to speak a little bit about Voltaire, Malebranche, later on, well, what was the Vietnam War after all? It was precisely the conflict between the kind of global so-called liberal economic order led by the United States and communism. The Vietnam War was precisely all about the entanglement of these two things, truth and power. And that scene is one particular instance where, in a kind of banal and vulgar way, we can see a certain truth draw upon power in order to try and install itself upon a people and a nation. Patrick.
Yeah, no, I thought it was interesting. Yeah, obviously your take on that was to kind of extract a few philosophical injunctions from these particular moments. But what I was thinking about, and I think it feeds into some of the stuff you're saying, especially about, this character. What's his name? Major Kilgore. Kilgore. Okay, all right, nice. Yeah. And we've kind of discussed this many times before, but he sort of epitomises masculinity in a particular epoch. Yeah, and what I thought was kind of like quite wonderful about this little segment of the film, which is obviously, as you said, revolves around his attempt to see this guy Lance, strike his stuff on the waves. He said it's almost like it gives us a foretaste, a forevision of these macho leaders, a bit like Trump. It reminded me of Trump's promise to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. And there's this idea, and I remember in Jacques Lacan as well, he has this thing that he dubs the jouissance of the father. Okay, now the father is like the sort of the principle of kind of almost like the principle of law and in the extreme sense the principle of reality as well. But precisely in that position, he's the one who legislates, who dictates, who punishes, rewards, and also says when you've met the standard, when you've not met the standard, and so on. But as part of the kind of luxury of his position, call it a kind of mutilated sovereignty of his position, he's also permitted all kinds of vulgarity, decadence, sloppiness, and hedonism as well. So there's this idea that you have to eat tidily, but the father can kind of like wolf down his food and spray crumbs everywhere. He's, that you have to make sure that you don't spunk your life away on prostitutes, but the father has to ensure that he has his little holidays and of pleasure. His little jaunts into the underworld is part of like his pay package, if you like. And of course, that Major Kilgore, what he wants to be, a figure that we're seeing actually quite frequently nowadays, what he wants to be is this kind of, a dictator of a kind of small enclave, So you get like, I don't know, in certain schools you get, which are run almost like, totalitarian states. You get the head teacher who kind of struts around and waltzes around the corridors and punishes arbitrarily, and he becomes like the dictator of the school. And you even get like, people working on the, head of departments becoming the little pot-sized kings of the corridor and so on. And it seems to be a slightly grander level. You have, the stuff like the Yanis Varoufakis says about Amazon and places like that. There's no market inside Amazon. Amazon is run like a sort of totalitarian communist state, with a quite like strict hierarchical structure. And, and Mr. Bezos himself at the kind of top, And so I thought that what's interesting here is this attempt to install a really like kind of primitive form of leadership within this tiny sort of segment of the world, his troops. And you get that moment again, which you how should I put it? You kind of pinpointed or snapshotted in the selection of that particular moment of film, where he's talking in that kind of purring voice, almost Trump-esque, about my boys, make sure all my wounded, are taken, get to the hospital in under 15 minutes, I want my men out, that kind of thing, they're his men, but nonetheless, as this kind of father figure, as this benevolent dictator, as long as you remain one of his underlings, one of his sort of serving boys, one of his acolytes, he will look after you, care for you, caress you, fondle you. Which is obviously there's a scene that you didn't include, but we watched together before, but afterwards in the campsite, where they're all sort of sharing beers and singing songs from the Old West, trying to recreate like a sort of fantasy of what life was like in America, in this utterly displaced utopia in the sort of wasteland of the battlefield. It's just I can't even like compute and digest and distill all of that richness right now, because but it's just it's this mix of poignancy and absurdity, they're passing around the guitar, if I remember rightly, and stuff
Yeah. No, it's incredible. It's incredible. Yeah, and then they have the cow that they've carried with the helicopter, where they're making steaks. And Kilgore's like, I want mine rare, bloody.
Yeah.
And then there's that kind of I don't know. I think the great thing about that film again is this point of as if by accident, because when things are forced, right? So I'll just talk in a minute about what the young captain says in that moment. They come out almost as quite banal and pithy, but they have this this luster of wisdom, that I so hate and despise in poetry and quotes, and it's where he says something like, the more that they tried to make us feel back at home, the more that we missed it, or the more that it made us realise that we weren't there. I think the other thing, to link back to what we've talked about in previous seminars, where you've talked about these forms of sovereignty, or like the Foucauldian conception of sovereignty that begins to emerge in psychiatric power. And here you make this distinction between, the father with his jouissance and, his ability to wolf his food down, whereas, the children must have manners. And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, that I was talking about today. And I've got a kind of long-standing interest in historically, sociologically, anthropology, and that's manners, and where manners come from. Now, I know, of course, for the sovereign, he decides when he eats. He eats when he wants to eat. He eats how he wants to eat. He's wasteful. He's luxurious, again, in his kind of expenditure. He wolfs things down. He uses his hands. There's a pretty good depiction of this in Lord of the Rings, where Merry meets Lord Denethor, and he's like kind of grabbing the chicken, and he's chewing on the tomatoes, and it's like dripping down his face, whilst Faramir, in his shining armor and his company, kind of almost marches to sheer death for valor and for honor. And the thing with manners is they actually emerge at a very interesting time, and for a I don't know, almost like a blatant social reason. So they emerge at the time of enclosure, which is when you have an emerging middle class. You have, in and through the application of the technologies of the Enlightenment and the technologies of enclosure, a lot of people who, they don't just have a lot of money, sometimes they have and make more money than the Lord. Some of them might even make more money from the king. And so all of a sudden there's a problem of, well, what do we do about these people who are no longer peasants, but they can't be sovereign? Well, you create this rule-based, this rule-governed space in which, the sovereign sits at the head of the table and can eat how he wants, and whereas everyone else, they have, finery and, they're expected to, they have all of these separate forks for different dishes, and they don't, you don't talk with your mouth full. You don't, chew with your mouth open. You eat with a certain finesse, a certain delicatesse, and that's what constitutes in both a material and symbolic way, if that distinction is even really meaningful in this context. It kind of constitutes in and through the ritual of the feast or the banquet a distinction that from being kind of double in the sense of the sovereign and his attendants and then the peasants. Well, now you have this wealthy middle class who are expected to follow all of these rules of politesse. And it's funny because New College at Oxford was founded at precisely this moment in history, and its motto, which is it's still there in wrought iron, I think, almost like Arbeck McFly is, the above Auschwitz, and it's manners maketh the man. And I always have a kind of disdain and distaste for manners for precisely this reason, because to act within the realm constituted in and through manners is to relinquish one's sovereignty, is to submit to a certain set of rules that, yes, kind of constitute or materialize the fact of your status as a member of the bourgeoisie or the petit bourgeois, but which at the same time negate your status as sovereign, as someone who has the ability to define a particular moment, who is precisely not subject to these rules of politesse, let's call them. Speaking of which, to be impolite, as usual, everything got a bit hastened at the start, and I don't have my water. So I'm just going to go and quickly grab a glass of water. And if you want to say anything, say something, or if you don't, I'll be back in 30 seconds.
All right. Well, I'm just going to prepare something, actually. Yeah. Well, what I was thinking about when you were talking.
I was just going to say, speaking of bourgeois politesse, we should probably charge for this. Product placement after all. Got a nice bit of a sunny tea going on. I'm off the tap water today. I'm onto the hard stuff.
Yeah. I was just asking myself, what actually is manners? Like, let's try and inhabit the mind of someone who respects, valorizes manners, but that, let's say, can't really be accused of being like self-effacing, of demeaning themselves in and through manners. What do they misdescribe as manners? Okay, because one of the things that manners do is this moment of when you encounter someone, you confront someone. Yeah, there's this moment of hesitancy, a moment of skepticism, almost like a sort of, how should I put it? A sort of turbulent intimacy that hasn't yet found its way into language. So what manners provide is a way of reducing the potential conflict and friction, setting the stage for some future conversation. Now, I don't know if that they actually I don't know if that works or not, but I think that's what many people think that happens. But what I think is that manner really represents a sort of degree zero of communication, and what people really crave and long for in that moment is simple reciprocity. Okay. I think that I can pretty much respond to anything that someone says to me on the street, whether it's leery, lurid, confrontational, but on the condition that I'm allowed to respond. On the condition that it isn't just chucked at, it isn't like a sort of hit and run moment of communication. That they don't just sort of bowl me over with it, leave me concussed, and then dash off again. I just want the idea. I just want the promise of an exchange. I want the promise of reciprocity. And so I think that lots of people have that longing, but they're too terrified for the conversation to become meaningful, for it to become controversial, for it to become contentious. So manner, like sort of modern romance, manner is this way of like sharing a sort of risk-free, low-fat diet way of sharing the world with another person. You know, which both constitutes its allure and also the way in which it sort of like debases sociability. Because, I don't know, let's say in French parks or something, or most of the conversation is pure manners. You know, the content of the conversation, even like, let's say, the verve and animus of a conversation is neutralized by the fact that all we're really doing here is reciting conventional forms of speech, like how the kids, what school are they at, you know, how old's this little one, you know, and so on and so forth. And there becomes, I don't know, they seem, what I'm trying to get at is what's so revolting about manners? Well, the cheapening of human discourse, you know, the cheapening of human conversation, and the sort of like the pretense that a conversation is actually occurring, and therefore this exchange of manners, this ceremonial exchange, takes up the place, occupies the place where a real encounter might occur.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that
like you talked about thrownness and about refusing thrownness. Well, to me, manner is another way of refusing thrownness. Why is that like extravagant or opportunist? I don't think so. You're thrown amongst these people, and instead of finding out your points of difference, instead of finding out your points of connection, instead of risking being seduced or tempted or bedazzled by this other person, what you do is you substitute in a form of standardized exchange, a form of neutralized communication. That remains at this kind of like tepid, low volume, degree zero level. And so, in some way, you're not admitting that you're really there in front of this person. You're not admitting that you're really a particular individual with a whole set of like desires, aims, fantasies, abilities, and so on, and that they are likewise. And that you're in a particular situation, let's say, that's constantly evoking reactions in you, provoking you to think this or think that.
yeah, I mean, yeah, so we will have to re-upload this because it has been incorrectly struck for the moment. I don't know when it will
What, the stream is
come
stopped?
back. Yeah, I'm just trying to work out
Because you keep going kind of jagged and as if, I don't know, like your screen keeps glitching and freezing.
it'll be fine. I can re-upload it afterwards. But it's kind of it's coming in and out. I'm just quickly seeing if there's a way. No, so what I was going to say anyway was that what I was going to say is that when I was in France, and it was like kind of this special gathering where we went to a friend of mine's house in the countryside, and we went to this place, and there was this conversation, and my French wasn't so good, but it was kind of good enough to participate. And I'd say something that I thought was, I don't know, insightful or funny or moved the conversation along in some way, or contributed, and was relatively fairly kind of quiet. And what I noticed is that every time I did this, it like bring this whole kind of like dynamic to like a crushing halt, in some way. And then someone else would like kind of pick up the baton of the conversation and move along again. And I mean, I really need to speak to my friend about this at some point, because it was quite interesting, and I'm sure she'll remember. But it was as if, like what you were saying, where I don't think that it was actually manners as such, but there was a certain way of conversing in which it was kind of like a social game. And so, certain things were expected to be said in a certain way, and would then move the conversation along in a certain way that was almost preordained. And even though in a kind of natural, functional way, I didn't say anything that was like abrupt or rude or offensive, in any way whatsoever. Nonetheless, it had the function of kind of, I don't know, like putting the brakes on, of the whole dynamic. It really was quite strange.
Yeah, that is strange. Yeah, but it's part of because I don't know, there should be someone who writes something called like manners and melancholia. Because I do think that the manners are this way of, as I said before, you can take it at this metaphysical level. They're a way of opting out of existence. Okay. They're a way of conducting a sort of a parallel life that is in some way immunized against and protected against, like the influx or the sudden infringement or impingement of reality. And what you do in that conversation, in those circumstances, or what anyone does who brings a kind of forceful, authentic speech, is that they reintroduce that excluded reality. Yeah. Reality might seem like a grand term, but whatever. I'm just going to leave it there as a placeholder for a second. But just here, it stands for precisely a level of thoughtfulness that's been excluded, a level of exuberance that's been excluded, and also a level of exposure of the self that's been excluded. Like, this is what I think, and here I am getting kind of carried away, and my enthusiasm is bringing me out in kind of like hives and blushes and making me sweat and stumble over my words, and it's that onslaught of reality kind of nauseates these people, because just like the young bird has kind of all of its food crushed up in the mouth of its parent before it has to eat them. Well, manners and the whole like ceremony and system of rules and gestures and decorum that surrounds it is like this thing for processing or digesting reality and turning it into something that they know how to process. And I often find in these conversations, either they just completely bomb, or people laugh, like for some reason, even if I haven't said anything funny. Or I need someone there who stands as a kind of intermediary or translator, Oh, here's the reason why that guy isn't a complete weirdo, and why you shouldn't run a mile right now. And none of this. Most of the time, all there's this form of like, oh my God, that's really interesting. Oh, that's great. Jimmy, come back here. Stop running. I'm sorry, I just have to go now. And I don't feel there's anything offensive about. Like, I'm not offended by this. It's just, it seems to me, this is why I talk about manners and melancholia. It seems to be because they've accepted a certain kind of diminished or stunted or existence, and they don't want to be reminded of its costs, because they're still human. Anyway, that's something like what I think.
I mean, is there a way to kind of, because I mean there are all sorts of parallels in terms of the manners, though not kind of absolutely homologous. It's certainly a form of power, or a manifestation of power, or a configuration of power, or an assemblage of power, and it's one in which the precise target is the body, which is what Foucault talks about in Psychiatric Power. He says that the target of power, what power always aims to control, to manipulate, to instruct, to confine, to in various ways dehumanize, reshape, refigure, remold. What is demanded is a certain kind of behavior. I remember when I was writing my thesis, I went to the British Library and had a little Foucauldian moment myself, looking in the archives. And in the archives I found all of the, not just the proposals for schools, which were generally written by societies of moral reform. So they could be Society for the Promotion of Cleanliness and Hygiene, Society for the Prevention of Alcoholism and Drunkenness, or all sorts of things. Now, in these documents that concern the foundation of the first school, they were very blunt about why they existed and what they were trying to do, and it was to produce an obedient, docile, and industrious populace. Now, the first kind of school that emerged, it was called the monitorial system. So if you imagine you have like a hall, and the lecturer stands at the front with his board, his blackboard, and there are rows of students. And at the end of each row there is a monitor. Now, there was, of course, the kind of gloss or glean of educational content. Let's say it's Latin, and the conjugation of a particular Latin verb. And each student would have a blackboard in front of them. And what they would have to do is they would have to write what they thought the answer was, and then stand up and present it to the lecturer or the professor or the teacher, whatever they were called at that time. Now, what's interesting about these documents is that they actually don't give a shit about Latin. They don't kind of go into, so here's Latin, here's the complexities of its grammar, here's, there's no kind of talk of methodology of teaching or apprehension, retention, the ability to read Latin, to translate Latin, to have a fluency of Latin. What is spelled out or illustrated in great detail is the movement and the motion. And if you think what the monitors are looking at, they're looking sideways, so they're not even seeing what's on the board. And so there are these magnificent illustrations of the precise way in which one should raise oneself and present the board such that it can be read by the teacher or the lecturer. And so, of course, the teacher or the lecturer, he can't really, the class might have had 50, 100, 200 students in it. So there's no way that he can, see amidst all those boards what's written on them. But what the monitors can see, and the diagrams, by the way, are from the monitor's perspective. They are side on. They can see if the expected bodily motion has been performed correctly. And again, that's something that Foucault talks about in Psychiatric Power. He tends about this striving for perfection of certain regimes, routines, bodily movements. Perhaps he's picking up on Technique de Corps, Body Techniques by Marcel Mauss.
Yeah, that is interesting. It reminds me actually that there was a teacher who was doing his qualifications that was recently having a kind of stint in Harris Academy. Because usually what happens is they spend 6/10 of their time in some quite decent school, and they have to kind of moonlight or do a little bit of a short course work in a slightly dodgier, school out in, Croydon, for example. And I was chatting to him about education. He was clearly someone who he was a really decent guy, and he thought of himself as a kind of theorist, yeah, and almost verging on a philosopher. But fundamentally, all of his theories about teaching were theories about crowd control. and clearly he'd swallowed about like 3 or 4 major textbooks, or like recent innovations in the subject, and he had all of these like terms and tactics for managing behavior, and not only managing behavior but also like soliciting and eliciting obedience. So he told me, for example, oh yeah, you've always got to like, and he had like these little catchphrases and slogans as well. You've got to front load the discipline, So there's this thing where you basically instead of having to discipline as punishment, you discipline in advance of what you want someone to do. So you give them this instruction like, okay, what you're going to do, and you're going to do this really quietly, and you're going to come up, row by row, starting with this row, and this row will go second, and then this row over here will go third. You're going to collect your whiteboards from the front, okay? And we're all going to do it with our fingers over our lips, okay? All right. So starting with this, so it's like front loading discipline. Front loading discipline is, yeah. You give the behavioural instruction as part of, let's say, the educational instruction, and he had like other ones as well, like you don't give like negative feedback about behaviour. What you do is you create like this environment where it's always the good people that are getting noticed. Like, John, you've been quiet for 5 minutes. Well done. John's been quiet for 5 minutes. Like, you've had you've been like working away there, without talking to your friend today. That's really, really good. And often to the extent where you lie to them, they haven't been good, but they've been good for like 1 minute out of 10. But you focus on that 1 minute and you make it dominate like their whole sense of how the lesson has gone. Now, in a certain like way, this seems like kind of like astute and shrewd and at least like to have some sort of pragmatic value. But like, it doesn't take long before you start to think, but wait a second, they're supposed to be learning science here, no? But really, this sort of baroque, convoluted schema of like rules and principles and tricks and forms of seduction and enticement had actually sort of taken up his whole mind, And so I was questioning about the subject, and he was just like, well, there's a curriculum, and it is what it is. Now, I do think that guy was like really lovely, and he could have been turned, and like in subsequent conversations, he was like really eager to hear about like my ideas and stuff. And he showed himself to be like someone who actually loves science. Nonetheless, it was quite worrying to think, not only did he have this, an idea of education that basically resembles the one that you've just described, and that conforms to like what Foucault calls a kind of moral orthopedics. But obviously, he was very young, and he was already a card-carrying member of this club. He was already a fanatic, but he didn't have any of the traits of the fanatic. He wasn't like zealous, or militant. And he wasn't like slamming his fist down upon the table. What he'd done, he was just taking it like, a fact. Like, this is good thinking. This is a clever way of teaching. And he was kind of proud of it in the sort of gentle, light-hearted way, as you might be proud of like, having lowered your golf handicap or something.
No, I'll tell you an anecdote in a sec. Just while you've got the new mic,
yeah.
Obviously, we'll be continuously improving our setup and our equipment. But if you think about, I don't know when you watch a singer sing, when they get louder, they move away from the mic.
Okay.
That's because what happens is like, if I kind of all of a sudden come here, it starts like clipping and comes a bit raspy. So it's all right. It's just something to think about. But since Jakob
requires a certain kind of moral orthopedics from me, then.
Yeah. Maybe just turn your gain down a little bit.
Yeah, all right.
But because both because Jakob's not here, but also because it concerns where we used to work, so I'm sure he won't mind. Is quite a funny little anecdote. It was when I was living in Copenhagen, and I was the equivalent of, I guess, like the duty manager of this bar, this pub on Nyhavn, which is super touristy, but it's the kind of classic picture that people take when they go to Copenhagen is by this canal with these multicolored houses. So it had like a terrace. Now the thing is, like, Denmark the booze there for most of the people is really expensive, but for the rest of Scandinavia it's cheap. So you get these Scandies who arrive on like the equivalent of booze cruises, and and they're already kind of a bit uproarious and leery and loud, And in the outside area, you did table service, and I went to this table and it was this kind of like cacophony of orders. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Have any of you ever been to a restaurant before? And they all, funnily enough, they all kind of suddenly like adjusted themselves in their chairs and sat up straight and kind of looked at me, like I was this schoolmaster. What was funny is, I was in my late 20s at the time, and these people were in their, I would guess, like their mid to late 50s or early 60s. And they all kind of, sat up straight and adjusted themselves in their chairs. And I said, well, since you don't seem to know, behaving so rudely, shouting your orders at me, I'll explain to you how it works. I'm going to start with the lady here. She's going to give me her order. Then it's going to go clockwise around. Each of you will give me your order individually in turn. I will take it, remember it, and bring it to you as quickly as I can. And then this one woman, she was like, ooh, are you British? In this Scottish pub in Copenhagen. But it's funny because it kind of involves all of the elements that you were talking about just then. Because I obviously don't participate in this thing. Yeah, I had a practical function that I had to, I had to get their orders. I had to do so quickly because the place was busy. I very rarely, in fact, as a kind of practice, I would not write people's orders down. So, sometimes I might take starter, main, drink, side for like 15, 20 people. It was just quite a good way, well, at least I thought at the time, of working on my short-term memory. But, I did adopt this very kind of grumpy British publican demeanour, which was very, fitting because it was a Scottish pub. And their reaction was to immediately go into this, like having been told off by the teacher. It was a certain transformation in posture. They all shut up, and then the slightly raised pitch of the almost kind of excited, like, ooh, are you British?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was hilarious.
Yeah, that is jokes. Yeah, I suppose also that there's another aspect of that as well, because you said just there that what you were forced to do was to kind of theatricalize yourself or adopt a really simplistic, almost like cartoonish persona, as whatever grumpy British person, grumpy Northerner, and that enables you then to that kind of helped you as well with this reduction of vocabulary, this reduction of of yourself to being someone who disciplines, who systematizes, who sorts things out, and so on and so forth. And I think that in schools as well, that, how should I put it? One of the problems one of the things that happens to a teacher is that either they just become one of these sort of bombed out, exhausted, kind of mutilated people who are constantly kind of apologizing for themselves, erasing their existence, and every now and again feebly sort of fuming at the kids, or they adopt a sort of, and this is probably like the better tactic, this cartoonish personality, and it could be, there's one guy in the school where I work where he's the kind of like, catty, bitchy, sort of like snooty gay guy, and he in a weird way, it sort of tricks the kids into learning in his lessons, because he doesn't mind like refusing them, batting them away. In fact, even becoming a sort of demon or a sort of a vaudeville or sort of slapstick villain. Yeah, and he solicits and cultivates the hatred of the kids almost as a different kind of attachment to what he's saying. Now, the only reason why I think it reminds me a bit of that stuff in your thesis about the clown, the teacher as clown. The only thing that's like bad about that is that, well, what are the kids actually being attached to? What is the regime, order and system to which the kids are being attached? Now, if it was like poetry and philosophy and a certain kind of scientific thinking, then it would be wonderful. If it was like, if they were attaching them to insights about the world and to a certain methodology of mind, that would be great. But fundamentally, it is this, and just to bring it back round now, this inculcation of manner, okay? And that always puts them in a certain kind of subservient, deferential, and subservient and deferential position with respect to authority, with respect to the institution. And it's precisely that for which the kids are in some way rewarded, patted on the back and congratulated. So maybe what we see in the park scenario, especially in French parks, and I'm talking about middle class people, is precisely people who did surrender to that system, were inculcated in that protocol of manners, subservience, deference, and decorum, and so feel a sort of mortification of soul, a laceration of soul because of that. So then when someone comes along, whatever this Mr. Reality arrives, they feel how should I put it? It becomes, what erupts is in a way sovereignty, is in a way the refusal of that subservience and deference. But it's something else. It's like something that now they've so utterly excluded from their own system of thought and their own modes of being, that it's like that film, The Thing, It's something mutant. It's something revolting. It's something sort of, this is why you see the build-up of these words: disgusting, revolting, seedy, sinister, grotesque, amongst these people. And what do all these things describe? Well, they describe a certain sort of from their point of view, an incorrect deployment of manner. That's not the way we do these things. You don't speak like that. You can't just run in here and say that. These kinds of things, these sort of vetoes and prohibitions. And just again, one further thing you said, like that obviously you were looking at the relationship between manner and power from within inside an institution, where manner is a form of subservience and deference towards the law and power embodied within that institution. But in those middle class milieus in the park, power is manifested in and through manner in a weird way, a different kind of power. So certain types of people within that park milieu are excluded on the basis that they are not well mannered, on the basis that they do not evince a certain kind of respectability, on the basis that they have not been socialized in some way. And just to finish this off, I was reading the beginning of that book, The Formation of Class and Gender by Beverly Skeggs, And what's interesting there is that the sort of demonization of the working class woman is mediated precisely through this concept of respectability. Okay, the working class woman is divided into two types. One, the person who's respectable and can therefore be approached and spoken to, and perhaps invited round and helped out, and a sort of protege perhaps for future cocktail parties. And then there's the other type who's kind of often labelled as leery or slutty or slaggy. What's picked up on is her different modes of dress, which are perhaps garish or grotesque, or suggest a kind of sexual promiscuity. The behaviour of her children, which suggests that she's not a good mother, in the middle class sense. Like, she hasn't properly socialised her kids. She hasn't kind of prepped and trained her kids to play with our kids. And thirdly, the behaviour of the father, whether he's able to gallivant around the town, act like a madman, impose his will upon our men and so forth. So we see there that the very manner which was previously a sign and function of their subjection, their subjugation, their kind of humiliation at the hands of an institution, now becomes the means through which they exert a different kind of power against another group of people.
Yeah, it actually brings me to another historical moment that I think I've mentioned before, and it's the work of Jacques Donzelot in The Police and the Families. Now, if you remember when I was talking about these societies for moral reform, they were generally led by women. And I think what's quite interesting about the feminist movement, of the suffragettes manifesto, is that it was kind of a bourgeois movement, and it was opposed by many working class women, and well, it'd be something really interesting to explore. But why was that? Well, because the bourgeois woman, the responsibilities that fell upon the working class woman, she didn't have, right? So these responsibilities to make sure that the child is well dressed for school, to make sure that they attend, to make sure that they complete their homework, that they behave well in lessons, to make sure that the husband goes to work, that he doesn't come home after spending all the family's money in the pub. All of these functions that working class women took up in the 19th century, and which became for them a source of power. But in my view, they were kind of hoodwinked or fooled, because they did gain a source of power within their limited domestic sphere. But what they actually became was a node or relay for a greater operation of state power, insofar as what were the children going to school for? They were going to learn how to be workers. Why was it that the women disciplined the men in such a way? Well, it was so that they were, docile. In the Latin sense, docilus, it means preparedness to be instructed. It doesn't mean like supine. To be docile, obedient, industrious workers. And that was a major source of power for women in the 19th century. And I think because the suffragette movement came from a higher, wealthier strata of society, a kind of bourgeois side, I think that introduced all sorts of complexities, and I don't think that those complexities have ever been, resolved. And part of the crisis in gender, in masculinity, in femininity, in LGBTQ that we see today, I think has at least part of its origin, part of its genealogy in a Foucauldian sense, like some key historical moments for that, is this moment where the woman becomes this relay or node for state power, which brings up this kind of Foucauldian evocation of the panopticon, in so much as they surveil the home, they make sure that within the home certain rules of propriety are followed. But at the same time, you have a feminism emerging from a different strata of society that necessarily implicates and involves them, but doesn't necessarily take into account or understand this particular conjunction or linkage of power in and through the working class woman as node or relay. I think that gets complicated again in the wars, where the women take on this incredible role of manufacture and industry. So it's not only the children are often sent away from the cities because of the bombing. So the children end up kind of living 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in barns and kind of all over the countryside. And the mothers, well, they remain in the city and they work in the factories. And then that's kind of another complexity and complication. And then you have the end of the war where, well, number one, loads of men have died. So there's a huge demand for labour. And so again, you have this another kind of complication of power, but this time it's kind of monetary and fiscal, in as much as women kind of very directly enter into the workforce, and then at the same time you have a lot of those kind of domestic tasks that would occupy a woman's day. You have like the invention of the washing machine, for example. Well, why was the washing machine invented? Well, there were all of these factories that had been geared toward a whole system of industrial production whole complex assemblage or dispositif of power that was geared towards industrial production for the purposes of war. And then it's like, well, what do we do with this? You know, how do we maintain this? How do we keep these people fed? How do we keep them housed? How do we keep them employed? And one of the answers was the mass industrial production of goods, and that's where marketing comes from. And so, like, funnily enough, the guy who invented kind of modern PR is a guy called Edward Bernays, and he was Freud's nephew. And there's a really magnificent interview of Eddie Bernays, you know, and he's a very old rich guy, and he's talking about this problem at the end of the Second World War. And he learned a lot of techniques from these guys called the Nazis, you know. And they had this word for it called propaganda. But, you know, that wasn't a very popular word at the time, so I had to invent another word. I called it public relations. And he talks about how he spoke to, you know, Uncle Freud, who was too busy with his own affairs to come over, but he sent one of his at least reliable students, you know, I don't know, in the kind of hierarchy of Freud's estimation, where this guy that he sent over to America from Austria, I think was, and he got them to psychoanalyze women in order to sell more products. And there are two that to me are really magnificent. There's one which is pancake mix. And so basically he performed this like psychoanalysis of, you know, like regression and a number of techniques upon women, and found that in some way the women that he studied, or at least the results of that study, suggested to him that this was robbing women in some sense of their sense of care in terms of, you know, the provision of nutrition and nourishment. And that's why you have to add one of the most potent symbols of femininity, which is fertility, in the form of eggs. And so by adding eggs, the woman had to crack and add eggs, and all of a sudden the sales went through the roof. And the other good one was cigarettes. So at the time, it was taboo for women to smoke cigarettes. And the tobacco industry, you know, desperate for this new market of women who enter in the workforce, it was the boomer period, you know, it was a period of great economic expansion, redistribution of wealth. So, you know, you have these women, this huge untapped market, but smoking was taboo. So, you know, what do we do about it? So again, you know, he gets one of Freud's proteges to perform a study. And that study suggests that, again, you know, of course, the cigarette is symbolically a phallus, you know, a cock. And the taboo is you know, somehow entwined with this relationship of the cigarette to the penis. So he stages this whole, you know, I mean, it has to be the greatest marketing stunt in history. He stages this stunt where he hires loads of women to turn up in some kind of, you know, big national parade at New York, and all at, you know, the same moment to pull out a cigarette and to smoke it. And at the same time, he kind of, through various nefarious means, briefed the newspapers that there was going to be a big feminist protest at this parade. And then the headlines in, I don't know, you know, the late edition or the next day were "Torches of Freedom," you know, which, you know, I mean, there you have it. You know, it's Lady Liberty, and, you know, what does she have? You know, she carries a torch of freedom. And again, you know, the sale, all of a sudden, this new market emerged, and women began to smoke. Kind of, yeah, it's a slight diversion. And then of course, you know, you have, as another kind of complexity in throw in the mix, you have the sexual revolution in the 60s. You have the kind of abject failure of the sexual revolution of the 60s. And when we get to the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, that's where Deleuze and Foucault fall out, right? Because Deleuze is very much in this Wilhelm Reich mode of the unleashing of sexual energy, of sexual positivity, of freedom, and all these things. And Foucault's point, or, you know, a point that Foucault will come to and that we will come to in the consideration of his work, is whoa. There is no sex without power. It's like that Oscar Wilde quote. Everything in the world is about sex, apart from sex itself, which is about power. And so Foucault's point, without being didactic or instructional, in an interview somewhere, he says, I'm not saying that these things are bad. I'm not saying that everything's bad. I'm saying that everything is dangerous. And he saw, I think, what precisely is manifested afterwards, which is that this so-called liberation into sexuality actually ensnared, and again, I think specifically, well, I mean, I don't know, but women specifically were kind of hoodwinked and hijacked by a certain notion that they would be liberated through promiscuity or, through sexual liberation. When in fact, who were the women promiscuous with? Well, they were promiscuous with men who were deemed to be of a certain social value, who had a certain social status, who were rich, who were famous, So to give in to their sex and the excitation of desire that was characteristic of the period and that which followed it, the 70s and the 80s, Foucault's point would be, well, you're just giving into power. And that's kind of exactly what happened. And now I think the mess that we're in now is because we've had all of these really important and significant entanglements, movements, transformations, groups of people moving, they have partial, full, thoroughgoing, limited, non-existent relationships to all of these different things that are going on in different spaces and at different times, but which all somehow interconnect. And I think what the internet did, and the kind of era of instant communication and information in which we now live, is that it just all of a sudden went, and it brought all of these kind of contradictions and all of these different trajectories and all of these different entanglements, and it brought them all face to face. And I think, that would be one hell of a history to unravel and and to think about, beyond the kind of bouncing along the surface, like a flat stone across a pond that I've just done there. But yeah, I think it's very interesting, and it's certainly something that we'll come to consider more. And in the vein of this period of Foucault's work, which is very much concerned with the relationship between truth and power, albeit in this lecture series very much in its nascent state, where he's very tentative and is addressing the criticisms of his old work as to the why. Why do these assemblages of discourse, of reason, of order, why do they exist? Why do they come to dominate or influence to such an extent that they shape, form, habituate people so that they live the lives that they do?
What's interesting about the Eddie Bernays, is it? Yeah, is his whatever in his let's say his intervention into the political scene. What he does is something like, let's say, capture the social energies, capture and then commercialize the social energies of the time. So we see from your micro history there, this idea of, okay, well, you have women, they're starting to, how should I put it, nurse new longings, yeah? They're starting to have a desire for a life that matches up to certain kinds of sublime concepts like freedom, like individuality, like, adventure. And one of the ways in which that may happen is through a certain intensification or development of the women's liberation movement. So you have the woman in this state of in this moment in human culture, in rehearsals for a kind of political maneuver that will take the form of, in some sense, without being dramatic or eschatological about it, but will take the form of a kind of rebellion or revolt. Now, what's kind of beautiful about that Torches of Freedom one is it quite cleverly captures and commercializes that precisely that animus, that dedication to revolt. And it reminded me of something that Mark Fisher says about what happened in England and America during the sort of late 70s and into the 80s, is that the left didn't see that there were a new set of kind of cultural, social energies that were beginning to sort of flourish and predominate. And one of these forces had to do with the idea that, okay, there were kind of huge systems, like one of which is bureaucracy, the other one of which might be a certain kind of a corporate system embodied in firms like IBM, that are kind of deadening everyday life. The individual, in his charisma, in his flamboyance, in his kind of style, can't flourish under those conditions. And Mark Fisher pinpoints this Apple advert, of like a really famous Apple advert of, I think it's 1984 or something, and it basically shows a group of sort of hypnotized, gooey-eyed prison inmates all staring up at a big screen, okay, and they seem to be in the process of kind of being brainwashed and dictated to by a big figure on this screen. And in these ranks of different, of seated rows, each individual is indistinguishable from every other. He's got kind of like a shaved head, like he's just in the asylum or something. He's got a sort of a greyish uniform on. And this scene there of like sort of George Orwell, Big Brother type indoctrination is intercut and juxtaposed with an image of a girl with a torch in her hand, who's like blonde and in colour and wearing white and is tanned and is kind of athletic and gazelle-like and beautiful, and she's running with this torch, and eventually when she finally gets to this little conference hall, she throws the torch at the screen and smashes it. And there's a sense in which it's like, okay, this is individual audacity destroying the old aura of systemic control. And just as in your example of this, of like, adding egg to the pancake mix, which both allows the woman to retain her freedom because she's not buried or besot or like, bamboozled with housework, but also allows her to retain her relationship to maternity, to nature, to like, how should I put it? Reproduction and care and so on, by adding this little egg, this symbol of her own fertility and her own productivity to the pancake mix. So two things are merged together and melded in that scene with the big screen and all the sort of like hypnotized inmates of this bureaucratic order. That's the old capitalist corporate systems of IBM and the sort of socialist bureaucracies. And I just thought it goes back to this dispute that you keep reciting between Foucault and Deleuze, because fundamentally Deleuze thinks that desire is a kind of a concept with that's sort of metaphysically fundamental. Okay, desire is in itself revolutionary or something. That's what he says. Yeah, and Foucault thinks no, the desire can be kind of like captured. Desire can be hijacked by commerce. It can be, if commerce is the prevailing form of power of that particular time, desire can be hijacked and captured by bureaucracy. Desire can be hijacked and captured by the school system. It isn't something that's metaphysically invulnerable, metaphysically absolute. And I think we see that kind of thing running over into our own times as well, in a much more convoluted, confused, and ambiguous way. With the way, like, I don't know, like let's say even 10, 15 years ago, you had the hipster cafe, which in some way captured and commercialized certain forms of philosophy and wisdom. You had quotes from like Aristophanes and Socrates and Nietzsche and Spinoza on the walls, And here philosophy becomes a sort of atmosphere. Wisdom becomes a kind of fragrance. And that longing to be educated, that longing to be cultivated, that longing to be wise, that longing to have theories about the world is in some tiny way assuaged receives a kind of substitute satisfaction when you sit in this hipster cafe and you're surrounded by these quotes, and you have people with certain styles of dress which express a sort of, you know, maverick attitude or whatever it is, or that make them look like they've been to university and so on, and that they dress in the style of, I don't know, the 70s and so on, where people used to read books, and I just think, power is something incredibly mercurial, elastic, and it can wear many different faces at any different times. It has, like, just a kind of astonishing ability to recreate this forms of disguise and subterfuge, and to parody basically everything that you think of as most important. It has its own version of wisdom, it has its own version of revolt, it has its own version of being anarchic.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to say, so I had to. It's now like six things, and I'll do it in kind of reverse order. So this idea of subterfuge, and just to is something that we will get into a bit later, because I think part of what, or at least one of the inversions that Foucault wants to make in regards to power. So, I've been, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about Voltaire, but he wants to get rid of this idea that power wears a mask. That's kind of in the Panopticon, precisely the principle is one of visibility. So, although the visibility is asymmetrical, so the prisoners are always visible and always conscious of their visibility, but the tower, which is imagined as this thing where any of the community can go into and look out from. So the idea is that you never know that you're being watched. And I don't know if that's like a knot or a tangle, or or by whom, like a knot or a tangle, but it's just something to be wary of. That, and then the other thing to say about that is that it's something that we've mentioned before, which is that power is always there. And so Foucault has this line that the perfection of power should tend to render its actual exercise unnecessary. But then what tends to happen is that it has kind of degrees of revelation that correspond to the level of truculence, resistance, or refusal. So, at first it might be, something that guides you without you even noticing. But then there might be a barrier, and then if you jump over the barrier, there might be some attendant who comes and warns you. And then if you ignore those warnings, he might be delegated a certain right of violence to restrain you. And then if you resist your restraint, then he might be able to call the police, and you might be charged with assault, and you might go to court, and you might have to spend time in prison. And that's something that I witnessed a lot in the school, where the assumption is that power functions in this. It's either silent or it's anticipatory. It's almost the kind of ideal or perfect school is one where there is just never any indiscipline, because the mechanisms function so well. But then when the mechanisms don't function, well, then there are structures, processes, procedures in place to kind of deal with that. And then when they don't work, and each time the articulation or the application of power becomes more vulgar, more immediately legible, more readable. But kind of advocating that loose reading of Foucault. And also, in my own thought, I don't know whether or not that's a knot, a tangle, a contradiction. But it links to the second thing that you talk, well, in reverse order, the second thing, which is this idea of, the hipster cafe. And it's funny today, I kind of I've got into this mode of refusal of hipster cafes, right? It's because they're everywhere now. You go to any major city in the world, pretty much, even kind of minor towns on the traveling circuit, in the middle of nowhere in Vietnam, and you have a cafe where you can get your flat white and your smashed avocado on sourdough rye bread, and they all have like a similar kind of aesthetic, and they serve similar kinds of foods. And what's really funny and ironic about that is that there was this book published in, I think it was 1992, by a French anthropologist, and it's called The Anthropology of Non-Spaces. And he was talking about non-spaces in the sense of like airport waiting lounges, or bathrooms, or these kinds of places. And kind of ironically, like having done quite a lot of travelling, especially in the last few years, airports have precisely become not non-spaces. They are very different and diverse. So, the English airport has, and this links to the first point, right? So it's like I was flying from one of the terminals at Heathrow recently to go to a wedding, and I had this like big carry-on because I was like carrying my kilt and all this stuff, and and it was really quite heavy, and the handle had broke, so I was kind of annoyed and irritated about this. And then also I'd had this thing at security because the kilt has like a knife brooch on it, and there was a bit of hoo-ha as to whether or not they'd take this off me, and and it was kind of a bit stressful. And you kind of enter into the the area where there's shops and where there's food, and rather than there being stairs down to where there's seating, it's like a circle, almost like a kind of viewing thing, and it forces you to walk past all of these shops before you can go down into the area where you can sit, repose, relax, rest. And so that's an example of and I was very conscious of this at the moment, both because I've read Foucault and also because I was pissed off. And I was like, you fucking bastards, like, you won't even let me just get to a seat. You're forcing me around this carousel of, things that I'm not interested in, I'm not going to buy. You're just wasting my time, and you're causing me annoyance and stress, just in a kind of a blunt and quite unsubtle attempt to make me buy things. And then I was on a kind of semi-business trip to Rome, which was related to our project L'Education Totale. And flying back from Rome, the airport is so kind of luxurious, and the security is so slick, and it's I think it's been kind of voted as like the best airport in the world. And it does, exude this kind of Italian sense of slickness, style, like a lack of friction. And there are lots of places to kind of, repose and to stop and to eat and to drink and to... Yeah, there are, places where you can buy your duty free, or you can buy your, your Italian cured meats, cheeses, wines, olive oil, these kind of things. But they're not in this British way, kind of like shoved in your face in an annoying way. They kind of, linger seductively, with their kind of like legs of meat, kind of hanging in this, like, almost like a kind of baroque scene of a Italian delicatessen. And so yeah, I find it funny that there's been this kind of radical inversion of non-space, in which precisely what was this space that had this what was an admittedly forced but nonetheless semiotic delicatesse, in terms of a particular kind of aesthetic, maybe some like some lounge beats in the background, a bit of jazz maybe, good coffee, nice food. That has become a non-space, and these places really irritate me, like I want the builder's caff, like I want my cup of tea with 50p, I want burnt soggy bacon, overcooked eggs. There's something kind of real and earthy and gritty about that I really enjoy. And these kind of hipster non-spaces, I really don't. The last few things, so it was just when you were talking about desire. So the thing that Foucault and Deleuze really clashed about was, and the line from Deleuze is, one should not desire revolution, for desire itself is revolutionary. And that was, of course, deeply rooted in anthropological analyses kinship. So when I was studying anthropology, I found myself swinging constantly on this pendulum in which everything was about kinship in the family, and then nothing was about kinship in the family. And I still haven't found, you know, my kind of position or answer to that question or problem or paradox. Whereas Foucault's argument was that I cannot see desire as lack, and that's why they had a big falling out. Now, lastly, kind of three reflections on this throwing. You know, you were talking about this symbolic act of the woman throwing at the screen. So the first one is there's this kind of darling of the circle jerk art world, by which I mean, you know, this kind of art that you only know about or care about or have a kind of inclination or understanding of, because certainly you know, her artwork is to me just absolutely shit. Yet, you know, she's exhibited all over the world. You know, her art's talked about in Frieze, in Art Forum, in, you know, kind of overlaid so thickly with interpretation. I almost imagine Hito Steyer's artwork as you know, like the body in Kafka's In the Penal Colony. You know, it's this body kind of over inscribed to the point of death. You know, to the point of murder, to the point of killing. And I kind of came across her because, you know, being part of the art circle jerk, it's closely related to the English literature circle jerk, you know, about which we talk and laugh. You know, every year around the time that the Booker list is announced and whatever, you know, the latest piece of absolute shit that they've decided this year chimes with, you know, the vital and urgent issues of the moment. Oh, ew, ew. You know, probably whilst farting into wine glasses and, you know, giving it a nice sniff. There's a book of hers which I was immediately attracted to. You know, I was lured, I was seduced, you know, I was fooled. It's called The Wretched of the Screen, and I read it and I was like, this is like derivative tosh, you know, it's drivel. Just go and read Baudrillard, you know, like just forget about Hito Steyer. You know, like I mean, I even kind of resent mentioning her in a certain sense, you know, because it like, lends her, at least in my view, some credence. You know, maybe you know, someday in the future I'll inflate her book sales, which is something that I'm deeply resentful about. But anyway, her most famous work, it's called Smash, and it lacks any of the kind of richness or value or power of what you were just talking about. But nonetheless, in a superficial level, kind of involves similar elements, and it's a short film, and honestly, I couldn't stop laughing while I watched it. I was like, fucking hell, man. Like, people are, you know, there's a whole world, there's a whole economy, there's a whole group of people who, you know, who have their heads so far up their own arses, you know, they can't taste the difference. What's that line in that film? You know, you won't be able to taste the difference between shit and shoe polish or something. Yeah, she basically, in this very short film, there's a big screen that's got something on it. You know, it's so unremarkable, I can't even remember. And she walks up to it with a hammer and smashes it, you know, and that's it. You know? And for this, you know, she's lauded as this great of the art world. But, you know, she's a terrible thinker, a terrible artist, and then, you know, she's got all of these people kind of ejaculating all over her with their rabid and enthusiastic inscriptions. The second was around the context. I think it was, you know, during the Iraq War, and it was when that guy threw his shoe. And it might have been Syria. It was Syria or Iraq, and it was Saddam Hussein or Assad, and one of the audience like threw their shoe at the dictator, and this was like, you know, an image that was like on the front page of all the newspapers, and, you know, kind of occupied the news cycle for a while. And then, you know, to bring that all the way back to Foucault, we go all the way back to Mad King George, and we reassume the richness and complexity that we discussed in a previous seminar, where, you know, he, as sovereign, subjected to disciplinary power, adopts, or, well, you know, there was some, not disagreement, but, you know, conversation about which, again, you know, I haven't come to any conclusion, but it's rattling around there in my mind as to, you know, whether or not this was, as you kind of put it, actually a kind of sovereign act. or whether it was my riff on what you were saying, where it was a kind of a rendering absurd the whole order into which he was situated. But anyway, certainly there is there's the she doesn't throw. I don't think she throws the hammer. She hits, but the guy definitely throws the shoe, and the king certainly throws his shit.
I was going to say something there as well, because there is, like, you kind of preempted me a little bit and anticipated something that I was going to mention, but it's precisely in these, and the writing community that you mentioned, the art community you mentioned, the good examples of this. But there's some sense in which people want to take the sort of debased ersatz, mutilated form of something for the real thing. Okay, the kind of fake form is effortless. Success within the fake form is kind of automatic and guaranteed. And like, when, let's say, if you were amongst the friends, like admirers and how should I put it, students of that artist, and you came in like Diogenes with his plucked chicken, saying, "Behold, man," crashing into Plato's academy with his plucked chicken, saying, "Behold, man," they would take this as a kind of like, as something inadmissible, egregious, an act of like disrespect, almost like sacrilege, yeah. And weirdly, one of the ways in which like that they in order to save face, because they also have to maintain the idea of themselves as kind of like maverick rebellious, you often get like scapegoated as a kind of killjoy, party pooper, yeah, because that's fundamentally what you have done. You've ruined the party. Yeah, everyone was enjoying themselves. I was the writer, this other guy was the architect, this other guy was the painter. We were on top of the world. We were like the Sartre and Foucault of our times, and you've just come in and told us that our self-confidence is baseless and groundless. You fucked up the party. And I think that these like ideas that people have of themselves, these like deeply flawed, kind of clueless, self-deceived ideas that people have of themselves, are facilitated and sustained by a certain kind of like form of community. Yeah, usually a kind of nepotistic, like self-congratulatory one, but that often occupies, or has kind of like, how should I put it, staked out and circumscribed and cordoned off and kind of created a citadel around the kind of really small point of power. Right? We've often talked about how publishing companies function in this way. The publishing companies, publish their friends, and the people that review the books published by these companies and written by are also friends of these people, and so on. And their kind of like relationships and romances are consolidated in and through this circle jerk of praise and congratulation. And I thought, each underwrites the other. Is a sort of like a policy of I'll rub your back and you rub mine. And I found out the other day that even amongst people who do not belong to those kind of insular, nepotistic friendship circles that have kind of staked out and dominated a particular position of power in our culture, that actually a lot of it is fostered and exacerbated by agencies. So what agencies will do, they'll have numerous writers on their books, and they'll create sometimes contracted or sort of like gentlemen's agreements between different writers that they will write, rhapsodies. I'll write a rhapsody on the back of your book if you write one on the back of my book, and so on. Now, before I said that, one of the things I wanted to say is to link, often our critique of these people takes a similar form to our critique of manner, okay? Because what justifies someone thinking of themselves as a writer or artist is that their work conforms to a particular, how should I put it, an empty display of technical ability, okay? And this empty display of technical ability, like the ability to craft a kind of sentence that people can be like, oh yeah, that demonstrates, what we've now imbibed and absorbed as good writing, this sort of fetishized, sublimated idea of what counts as good writing, or this embodies, like, let's say, the criteria that we've absorbed of a good story. It has the certain kind of shape that we expect a story to have, and the sentences have something that we call taught, and the insights have something that we call astute, and so on. And that kind of vocabulary of praise, and that particular style of writing seems to me to be absolutely isomorphic and symmetric with the behavior and comportment that we're calling good manners. It's almost like those people are justified as and validated as writers in and through producing a kind of good manners of prose, the equivalent of good manners in poetry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I was already linking those 2 points, and I think So the first thing is this kind of rhapsodization of other people. I mean, if you read the first volume of Anti-Oedipus, who writes the preface? Well, it's Foucault. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that when the work is good, when the work is great.
Definitely, yeah.
And when it's not trapped and confined in these arcane, obscene, disgusting kind of structures. I have like a turn of phrase that I use to refer to the these works, and then this is going to link into manners and what you were saying. I call them bent over double wanking sandpaper disaster pieces. And that's because in this way it's like these people are so like crumped and crimpled by these rules, and their writing just grates. It has no flow, no rhythm, no looseness. There's no space, there's no movement, there's no, I mean, you just take like a line from David Foster Wallace, or the great lines in literature. So just like a couple that come off my head would be the opening line of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. And Hunter S. Thompson, he didn't need anyone to write about his writing, because great work speaks for itself. And the opening line is, it was on the edge of Barstow where the drugs took hold. And he goes into this kind of magnificent, spectacular paragraph where these, bats appear, and the closure at the end of the paragraph where, with the lawyer, and it's like, it's his turn to drive. Better not mention the bats though. The poor bastard will learn soon enough. It's just magnificent. It kind of it opens with something so pithy, but at the same time provocative and insurrectionary, and then it opens up and it has so much space, and then it closes itself in this really beautiful way. I mean, like this passage that I've committed to memory just because I love it so much is from Moby Dick by Melville, which of course has what I think is just the greatest. I don't think anyone is ever going to match, a first line like "Call me Ishmael," which is so rich, textured, layered. It's just, it's brilliant. I mean, yeah. Look at me. It brings so much joy, and it's a paragraph in that novel. It's certainly one of the great novels. And again, it's to write about Melville. In a sense, we can talk about Melville, but you have to. I don't know. It's like what you say. We have to out Shakespeare. And it's like, how the fuck do you out Melville? I mean, fucking hell, just do something else. Don't even try. And it's this passage. It's the warmly cool, clear, ringing, perfumed, overflowing, redundant days were like crystal goblets of Persian sherbet, heaped up, flaked up, like rose-watered snow. The starred stately night seemed doughty dames in jewelled velvets, nursing at home in lonely pride the memory of their absent conquering earls, the golden helmeted sons. And I mean, bro, in that it's just magnificent. It's overwhelming. It blows you over. You want to read it 10 times. Kind of luxuriate in it, like.
But don't you think that the sort of natural take on that? I mean, I'm absolutely agreeing with you, but I'd like a couple of things that I need to say right now. One is that if that were released now, under the guise of being like a new work, people would kind of like wrinkle their noses at it. They think there's a kind of like excess of brilliance that I think has become unreceivable, almost inaudible. Yeah, because even when I'm listening to it there, I have to be immensely attentive to like changes of tempo, rhythm, you know, the unfurling of the prose, the kind of like weird way in which he's able to shift the prose on, but at the same time, like dally, enjoy, savor these words and their sounds, like as they pass, you know, through the larynx, you know, and across the tongue and so on, you know, and then it made me think that, like, actually, I was stupid a second ago to say that these writers rhapsody over each other, because in fact they can't rhapsody. Rhapsody is just a word that does not belong to their form of praise. And I even thought your description, which was incredible, is also wrong, because like just in the way that we have to out Shakespeare, like you have to kind of like be as flat and boring in your criticisms of these people as they are in their writing, you know, like because in a weird way you're sort of rescuing and salvaging something from their work by being able to turn it into this, like, you know, kind of like exuberant, cartoonish like sentence that has like so much like character and verve and like intricate inventiveness. It's like you can't put that kind of bouquet on this grave, you know. It doesn't go there.
Yeah. No, and so yeah. No, go on.
Yeah. No. So I was just thinking that, like, it's. I don't know how to describe it. It's like I think we've gone beyond manner now, because in some way, manner still implies a certain sort of like poise and composure, all right? But in what you just said there made me think of something else, that it's something baser than that we're at now, you know? It's something like bowed, crippled, haggard, you know, almost like a kind of sclerosis has taken place, you know, or a dementia has sort of swept across the literary landscape. And we used to have this rich language, and now the language we use is a kind of like detritus blown from like a million miles that way, you know, from some old civilization. You know, we just have the kind of ruins and specks and dust. And so I like, and of course we try to like polish the shit, you know. We try to arrange this dust, you know. We try to put like the detritus in little rows and everything like that. But you know, it's something slightly more, what's the word, like emaciated and you know, rickety than manner now.
No, I mean it certainly is. But I think what's interesting about these people, you know, I mean I really do like that, you know, bent over double sandpaper wank disaster piece, you know, because I think it somehow it evokes something of what's going on. But this bent over double thing is yeah, manners have reached a certain kind of excess, you know, and you see this in a scholastic context with people. Oh, and you know, perhaps if I may, and make this suggestion, and you know, as Omar Jalili might put it in his comic routines. But these people are very much, you know, they are petty bourgeois, and they're always, you know, very well mannered, you know. They're very oh, and you know, it was such a lovely reading, and I found it really fascinating. You know, we can use some of those words you used before. You know, oh, and I found that, you know, the observations that you made were astute and speak to the urgent, vital issues of our time with such elegance and grace. You know, it's this kind of like almost tripping over oneself. You know, like it's a form of speech that takes the form of an inability to speak. You know, like an interruption. Yeah. And then to be ill-mannered, I just thought, you know, how do you out Melville? How do you out Flaubert? I just thought it'd be worthwhile to show, you know, in one of my own poems that that you know, and you know, funnily enough, I've asked you to write about, and you know you every time you get into kind of these like paroxysms of, you know, impossibility, it's hard to do sat down, but it displays these kind of things that, you know, that you were mentioning, and has, you know, a lot of characteristics of good prose, you know, like tightness and an ability to like move and to expand, but then also to linger and to pause. And yeah, I just kind of had the idea about, being in a bar and looking at women, and I think maybe it was when I was working in that pub because when you work in a pub, there's a constant kind of social diorama going on. It's an incredible place to be as an anthropologist, especially in Denmark, because of the whole thing about people falling in love with Danish women who are free and kind of exciting and liberal outside of Denmark, and then they move to Denmark with them, and then they're just like, fuck this, fuck Denmark, can't cope with these rules. And so you have this carousel, right, of this kind of what you might even call in a Foucauldian way a subject function, right, where there are so many men, and they turn up to the bar kind of depressed, and you find out, well, what's your story? And it's always the same, and it's always that they've fallen in love with a Danish woman in outside of Denmark, or outside of a kind of like rigid, rule-bound Danish context. Then they've moved to Denmark to be with her, and then found life there so rigid that it's utterly intolerable. And they always tell the same story. And then this is also like, I lived with 2 Danish young women, and it's almost like in Denmark, this is like an expected part of Danish maturity, right? So, the women, they go to Danish schools and they live Danish, and then they meet a kind of macho or charismatic man, or and they have their time with them, but then they realize that a good, reliable Dane, who acts well, he's well mannered, who acts like their little Labrador or sausage dog, but with the added advantage that they pay for their bills, or they carry their bags when they go shopping, or they do the heavy lifting up and down those stairwells without lifts in the desirable neighborhoods of town. But no, just quickly to do the poetry thing. It's called Two Lasses, and it's I saw her at the bar, no makeup on, and quickly she picked up the menu and perused the starters and decided to have a side of chips anyway. Her body was perfect, and you could tell that she hated it because crafted in the gym, there were parts unnatural tone, not alien-like, nor from Mars, but definitively odd, and garlanded with mop draking silks the finest, as your shoes. I thought some lace might be in order before the pint started pouring, and the long-legged limpet sorter in sideways did stumble. The glass that she fell onto, fortunately not breaking into lethal shard, but into small bits and pieces that cut her arms, chest and face just a little. Clearing up the blood, I wondered about the other bird so elegant, and then a fellow walks in, socks, sandals, ripped jean shorts, and a cleanly barbered lid that makes you point your finger go, Brill cream. So I looked at him and I thought about it. I thought of the winter time and the quiet time and the more time for night. I thought of the hiding young lovers, warm, hot and glowing, basking in the rays of the old smouldering dark. I thought of the very fact of the distant stars glistening in the sky, and then I thought, fuck, you stupid bastard. They're not so special, after all.
Yeah. It's funny because I think you've got this ability to, I don't know, to capture this weird, like, how should I put it, like a sort of a voice, like a pure voice that kind of like spasms with madness, a mad dialect, a mad tone, a mad sort of like of charisma that in some weird way, it's almost like when you hear. When you go on Google, like, and you Google Translate, and you translate something into French, and you translate it back into English again, and it comes back completely transformed, like this sort of alien being arrived from another planet. In your writing, it's like there's this sense in which it's like an unknown extraterrestrial foreign language translated back into English again.
Yeah.
And it gives it, I don't know. Yeah, I've got like an absolutely banging head that I've had for the last 2 hours, so I'm finding it difficult to like exactly like sort of pluck down from the tree of language all the words that I want. But it gives it this this weird mix of kind of joviality, a carnivalesque merriness on the one hand, and then something kind of like disturbing and disarming on the other hand. As if you were hearing you know, someone who's like close to you, a good friend, talking in this familiar voice, but nonetheless saying things that you think, you know, the verge on the nefarious, you know. I don't,
Yeah.
they're like normal desires, but slightly tilted, disjointed, deranged.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. I was, you know, I was trying to out Flaubert. You know, I want to write nothing but style. I think, you know, the whole point of that is to, well, at least when I was writing it, was to, at that point at least, you know, to kind of push language to its extremities, to its limit point, you know, to where it's a pure exuberance, it's a pure luxury, and that the moment that it talks about is absolutely banal, absolutely insignificant, yet the themes that it kind of raises, invokes, or touches upon are really, you know, kind of profound in some way and fundamental.
And maybe that's what I feel as well. It's like there are these kind of like bristling, you know, bubbling psychic energies that are somehow channeled in this poem, and yet the mind is like kind of like stumped and discombobulated, because it's like, how are those psychic energies being channeled when we've got like someone talking about a plate of chips, you know, and looking at a menu, you know, and a barman cleaning up, you know, what the fuck does that have to do with the cosmos, you know? And the fundamental questions of being, because they're not raised. Now, that's why I think even like your idea of themes is not quite right. It's at the level of tone, you know, of kind of like of melody and of rhythm and tempo. Something like almost like desperate is conjured. Something very intense is conjured. But then, and it's only picked up on through, first of all, juxtaposition of some like, you know, like fabulous piece of like controlled lyricism with a piece of like, you know, mind-stumping banality, you know, that kind of like mischievous juxtaposition, that impish juxtaposition, but mainly through when it suddenly takes off, spirals, and goes into this kind of verbal fugue, you know, that you're able to sustain over like often for a sort of like, you know, perilously long period of time. These sort of like high wire, you know, gallop with a horse across the high wire, you know.
Yeah.
And then it's like listening to it puts you in that same state of fugue, you know.
Well, so kind of conscious of time and just thinking that, you know, next week we're going to be looking at Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas. You know, because once again we've managed to do everything but talk about the text.
But there wasn't a text this week, was there? It was a review or something.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was something, you know. It was the excuse for us to have a chat. But you know, I think it'll be good next week with Mary Douglas because it's much more concrete, you know, because it is anthropology, and also it's one of those books that, well, beginning to read it again, I saw it with a whole new kind of richness, which is again, you know, part of what we're doing. You know, I found kind of like veins of gold, new thing, you know, new ways in which the work is so brilliant and so magnificent. And that's precisely because of its status within the discipline of anthropology. Now, because it concerns something so everyday, so normal, and in fact so disciplinary, and so much about power, and so much about taxonomy, right? Which is exactly what we've been kind of, or well, what Foucault's been talking about, and which is why, you know, to in any way really get, I mean, maybe you get something from these things, but certainly it's like, kind of, you know, what Foucault says about Lacan, you know, like read his books, you know, you have to do the work, you have to read Foucault, and then all of these, you know, kind of parabolic, acrobatic ways that we, you know, kind of jump off and return and all sorts in regards to his work, you know, certainly would make more sense if people actually read them. But because we're going to take a break, and you know, and thinking to the future when we have more of these and they're arranged as, you know, into kind of like little courses on each lecture series, there's kind of like playlists, and then we'll put them on as torrents and, you know, circulate them in whichever way we can. I mean, you know, just like send them as DVDs for free to universities, whatever, you know. there are all sorts of possibilities of what we can do with these afterwards, with with like a reading list attached, with all sorts of stuff. I just wanted to really focus for a moment upon this entanglement of truth and power, which is really what Foucault is beginning to engage with in Psychiatric Power, and to do so again, moving away from the text in order to approach it from a different direction, by talking about something completely different. Like the Monty Python sketch show, now for something completely different. And so I was thinking about what Foucault kind of constantly does is he does these massive kind of inversions. He overturns, which is to me the fundamental task of the philosopher, right? Which is to clean up confusion, to dispel illusion, to allow one to see with precision or clarity, such that one can live consciously, fully, almost like Thoreau, I went to the woods because I wanted to live deliberately. And so one of these, and I've always thought him to be a kind of pompous fool and an idiot, is Voltaire. And one of the targets of Foucault is precisely Voltaire, and Voltaire's idea of speaking truth to power. This phrase repeated ad infinitum. It's like, guys, people have been saying this since the 60s and it's never done anything and nothing's changed. Why are you still recycling the same old shit? Like, it doesn't work. And of course it's because truth is fundamentally entangled within power. And truth always comes from a position of power. So I wanted to just engage a little bit with Voltaire, who I think is both a pompous fool and a complete idiot. And you can see this in and through his canonization, which is of course in and through Candide, or I don't know if it's On Optimism or Candide the Optimist. And basically Candide, if you didn't know, Candide is a parody of a French philosopher called Malebranche. Malebranche is this guy who said, we live in the best of all possible worlds. And so Voltaire, he wants to parody Malebranche by constructing this scenario in which there's a guy called Candide who's naive and optimistic, and this guy called Pangloss, and Pangloss takes him around all these different worlds in a kind of attempt to empirically demonstrate that how can this monstrous, violent, disgusting, despicable scenario be the best of all possible worlds. Now, the point is that why he does so is in and through faith. And Malebranche, ironically, was a theologian. You have this naive young chap, and he believes that he lives in the best of all possible worlds. So Pangloss, to disprove it, he takes him to various scenes of like decadence, corruption, cruelty, etc. But the target is precisely misplaced. Because Voltaire is a pompous fool who doesn't understand what Malebranche says when he says we live in the best of all possible worlds. Because Malebranche does not mean this in a technical way. Everything is perfect, the people are happy, they're healthy, they're free from want, truth and justice reigns supreme over peace and harmony. Malebranche isn't saying this at all. He's saying that we live in the best of all possible worlds, precisely and ironically in the Enlightenment fashion, which is accredited to Voltaire. And he's saying he's saying it from a position as a theologian, right, in the matter of faith. Whereas in the Enlightenment, at the beginning of the Enlightenment, the emergence of the notion of causality, the early Enlightenment thinkers thought, well, if everything's caused, then there is no will, there is no responsibility, there is no God, there is no intention, there is no such thing as a criminal. What an absurd and a ridiculous notion. They are simply acting, at the end of like a long list of causes. And so it's albeit from the perspective of faith, it's in that sense that Malebranche. I hope I'm getting it right, by the way. It is Malebranche. This is like kind of.
Yeah, I thought like maybe Malebranche has a similar idea, because I don't really know Malebranche. But I definitely know that Leibniz has this idea of that we live in the best of all possible worlds. But maybe Malebranche has this idea in a different way, because Leibniz's idea is more to do with like mathematics. But anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean.
But maybe he's targeting both of them.
Yeah, it could be. But anyway, you know, whether it's Leibniz or Malebranche, I mean, you know, well, at some point we'll have to do a Greats in Thought on Leibniz and Malebranche now. You know, we can add them to the, you know, to the long list of people to read and talk about. But yeah, you know, he's saying it in a technical sense where we live in the best of all possible worlds, because this world could not be in any other way than the way that it is. So, you know, like, you can transfigure this into an ordinary, everyday perspective, right? So, let's say that you try to fix something, and in trying to fix it, you make an even bigger mess. Well, a completely normal response from a thoughtful or compassionate person would be, well, you did your best. You know, you did your best. And so it's not about whether or not the materiality of what happens is the best. It's that the best possible course of action per yourself has been taken. And that's a kind of, yeah, like a parallel to, you know, to what, be it Malebranche or be it Leibniz, is saying. And that's why I think, you know, Voltaire is an idiot. I think he's an idiot in, you know, when he says, speak truth to power, you know, as if just by, you know, the speaking of truth, you can overwhelm power, overturn it, which is, of course, a nonsense. And so this relates directly to Foucault, right? Because for Voltaire, and it relates again to what we were talking about before in terms of subterfuge and masking. You know, for Voltaire, the power kind of hides behind truth. You know, where truth shines, it's blinding light. Power scuttles like a cockroach into the shadows. Power lies, power manipulates, power conceals. And to this, Foucault, you know, says it's nonsense. There is no truth without power, and no power without truth. To be engaged in the game of power is to be engaged in the game of truth, and to be engaged in the game of truth is to be engaged in the game of power. Now, in psychiatric power specifically, this is very clear and straightforward and evident in a way that becomes more slippery later on. But at this point here, where what he's trying to demonstrate through an analysis of the first psychiatric hospital, that there is not, you know, and it's quite an incredible thing to say, really, that there is not at first a true object that is madness, that calls upon, necessitates, and renders legitimate the operations of power, such as seizure, confinement, dehumanization, medication, treatment, etc. But that the object of madness that will justify the relation of power that follows it is not primary, does not exist, and cannot exist in and through the relationships of power themselves, without the kind of justification. So basically what he's saying is that the power that in order to constitute the mad as an object, in order to have the diagnosis, in order to have the taxonomy, well, first you have to have stripped this person from their social context, right? So in order for it to have the power of science, the validity of objectivity, they have to be robbed of like a social context that could interfere, you know, in and through the presence of confounding variables. They have to be put in spaces where they can be observed. They have to be interviewed. They have to be forced to confess. They have to be forced to speak. And so, you know, practically and empirically, it's only by confining the people, these residuals, as you might call them, these people who are inassimilable to the current order of things, these people who don't, can't, or refuse to behave as expected, it is only by making them submit, by forcing them to speak, by confining them such that they can be observed, that psychology can gather the datum on the basis of something like a taxonomy of madness can be formed. And this is where we are at this moment of Foucault's thought. He's making an important intervention to dispel illusion, to clear up confusion. in which it is not like the pompous fools like Voltaire say, that truth is power's nemesis. Where there is truth, there is no power. Truth forces power into retreat, but rather that there is no truth without power, and that power, rather than being opposed to truth, relies upon it, calls upon it, and takes it as its foundation, an essential element of its functioning.
I mean, that is interesting, yeah. I mean, it goes with all the stuff we've been saying so far about, like, I think only one thing I'd add to that is this idea that there are certain moments that within, like, a regime of power that produces, let's say, its own form of truth. Like, I don't know, the regime that you've just described, or the regime of the school system, yeah. There is still a sense in which it has to capture certain categories that somehow escape that system. So let's say the school system, or even like other systems of power, like the way in which intelligence is captured. Okay, so how is intelligence monitored? Measured and then expressed within the school system? Well, usually through grades, perhaps, and maybe there are some extracurricular activities that also express intelligence. Maybe if there's an art workshop or a theatre inside the school, or maybe there's a certain, like when I was young, a certain government-funded initiative to make all people of the age of 14 take a verbal reasoning, a non-verbal reasoning exam or IQ test. So we've got there a regime of power, that involves all the stuff that we've said that the school system involves, a certain behavioural regime and inculcation of manners and so on and so forth. Then we've got the production of a certain truth in and through the examination results and IQ tests and certain qualifications or diplomas that the school offers or supervises the achievement of. But we also have, it's almost like there would be no truth, and perhaps there would be no power unless it was installed, like not just in a particular location, like the land occupied by the school and so on and so forth, but also installed in almost like a psychic location. It installs itself precisely within that sublime sovereign category of intelligence, and sort of captures intelligence, tells us what intelligence is, tries to take control of the meaning of intelligence, tries to dictate to us the essence of intelligence, tries to define and circumscribe intelligence, and thereby excludes other things which in some other way do, like, are forms of intelligence, alternative anarchic forms of intelligence, or just in forms of intelligence that have been excluded, or that just don't show up on the radar of this particular regime of power. I just wonder where to go with that from within inside the paradigm that you set up. We definitely show that power and truth are still embroiled in one another, but what is the status of those alternative forms of intelligence understood with respect to the concepts of power and truth and their relationship to one another?
I mean, what I would say is that, we're going to get there.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Like Foucault, he gives his answer in The History of Sexuality, Volume 2, after making his manoeuvre in the 79-80 lectures. He comes to a certain kind of conclusion, or he doesn't resolve the paradox, but he finds a certain form of habituation of everyday living, in which this thing, whilst not being resolved, can at least be a site where the power that one exerts is upon oneself, in and through the conduct of one's conduct. I don't want to go too far, because I think, it's kind of, if we follow Foucault's manoeuvres himself as he deals with exactly these problems. But just to go, right back to, I think the first lecture is he talks about the way that power penetrates the, what is it, like the fibrous something of the brain, you know. So he metaphorically expresses exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I think for now, you know, we can. I mean, because there are also there's some interesting things about exclusion that relate not just to Jakub but to someone that he's working with at the moment called Pavels in his work. And I was at first kind of like overblown by the brilliance and ingenuity and originality of his work, and then I kind of thought for a moment upon it and became terrified, and then kind of articulated this really like kind of radical critique, and then I actually thought, you know, no, actually there's something more going on here, and I wanted to speak to Pavels about it. So I don't know, you know, maybe we could even get him to talk about his work.
Yeah, who's that? Pavels? Who's that?
He's called Pavels Hedstrom, and he's kind of an architect, but he's not really an architect. And he made the thing that kind of like made him super big, kind of famous, was it's like a jacket that you can wear that protects you from the elements, from the weather, but then you can turn into a shelter that gathers water, and like an app that collects real-time data that tells you where to put your shelter up in kind of mist and fog in the mountains. And then I think the thing that he's exhibiting at the moment at the Venice Biennale, I don't know what it is, but the last thing was the Gaia communication system. And so at first what I thought was, well, this is like you know, there's always this thing in which capitalism produces problems and then produces like a technological solution to a problem, and that immediately made me think of the Guarani, who I lived with in the rainforest, and the state of crisis that they live in, and how they have all of these abilities that almost, you know, to an outsider seem supernatural. You know, their connection with nature, their understanding, you know, their innate, fundamental and kind of immanent understanding of nature and the world and its cycles, and the kind of intervention that Pavels makes. My first reaction was one of kind of like awe, then of fear. Then I started to think, you know, does that not further, ironically, our alienation from nature? You know, by having to have this like kind of technological mediator in between. But then I thought that, well, actually, you know, there's something that's missing here. There's something more essential, and maybe he's up to something that's much more intelligent and much more thoughtful. And yeah, and I'm quite excited to speak to him about it. So yeah, maybe we can speak to Jakub and maybe see if we can. I don't know. Maybe even we could delay the interview and have like a little Greats in Thought special where we talk about these issues with Pavels. I mean, I don't know if he'd be interested to be on, but it's something to check. In regards to this, and you know, if there is anyone that's watching and it's been in and out, that's because we got a copyright strike from YouTube. Now, the clips that I used, they meet all of the rules for fair use, both in the United States and the UK, because it is for free, it is for education, it's only a portion, it's significantly edited and changed, and it's used for the purposes of commentary, criticism, thought, reflection. So hopefully we'll see how YouTube resolves itself, and whether or not it kind of, you know, in its own algorithmic way realizes that the video of Apocalypse Now at the start meets the criterion. But if it doesn't, what I will do is I will try and upload this tomorrow as a video that's not live, and then try and go through whatever procedures of like resolution for content strikes that they have. If that doesn't work, I will re-upload it a third time, where I essentially just record a short section of myself and say, you know, here there should be this section of Apocalypse Now that we will go on to speak about, but unfortunately, because of the asinine and algorithmic vortex of YouTube and copyright, you know, which, I mean, Apocalypse Now should absolutely be out of copyright by now. It's more than 50 years old, but because of the grasping, desperate clinging on of twats like Paul McCartney, it's been extended and extended and extended and extended and extended. I think it's 100 years now, which is completely ridiculous, considering that copyright in its first instance had nothing to do with ownership, but was only to spur precisely the kind of creativity and innovative use, commentary, thought, reflection, repurposing, whilst maintaining a certain period in which the artist or the creator could monetize their creation. And the way that's been transformed and transfigured into kind of, just a grotesque form of ownership. I mean, well, that's something to speak of in and of itself. But I mean, unless you have anything else to say, I think we can finish for today, and then next week we can speak to Jakub, and so it will either be the interlude, or we could, each of us, we could have a look at Pavel's work and maybe even get Pavel's on, and talk about these issues of truth, power, of intimacy, connection, alienation, mediation, technology, industrialization, because they are all in and around Foucault and Foucault's thought, and it certainly would make sense in the context of
sounds good. Well, obviously I'm up for anything.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I will stop the stream and see you next week.